Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure to speak with Vânia Penha-Lopes. Professor Lopes is a native of Rio de Janeiro and a professor of sociology at Bloomfield College in New Jersey. She is also co-chair of the Brazil Seminar at Columbia University and a former member of the executive committee of the Brazilian Studies Association. She graduated from the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro with honors and from the New York University with a master's degree in anthropology and a doctorate in sociology. Professor Penha-Lopes has done postdoctoral work at the Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro, and she is the author of several books on comparative race relations, including Confronting Affirmative Action in Brazil, published in 2017. Her most recent work is The Presidential Elections of Trump and Bolsonaro, Whiteness and the Nation, which came out this year. She is also a research fellow at the Washington, Brazil office. Vânia, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for your generous introduction.
Great. So let's jump right in. As a Black woman, originally from Rio, but with a successful academic career in the United States, what is your overall assessment of the current situation in Brazil?
That's
a big question.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's start out with an easy question, right? I think it's a very appropriate question because I always think of myself first as Black, and then a woman. And I look at the situation of Blacks throughout the world, and I see that it's characterized by successes and then turning back because history is not linear, life is not linear. So it concerns me that a population that is descendant of people who created a country on their backs, with their arms and legs, but also with their minds, also with their heads, that are still having to look over their shoulder. I'm talking about the indiscriminate murders of Blacks in Brazil, because it's not only in the United States that we have to keep telling people that Black lives matter. So when it happens here in the United States, for example, George Floyd, it gets international coverage. Everybody is rightfully outraged, but it happens in Brazil every day. And I remember growing up, and I grew up during the dictatorship, how at the end of the day at rush hour, people would be standing at the bus stop waiting for the bus. The buses would be crowded. People were going home. These were workers. And a military police car would stop and ask for documentation, ID, because we know that in Brazil you have to walk about with your IDs on you at all times. But they would only ask Black men for their IDs. Either that, or they would get on the bus and just go and approach Black men and ask them for ID. And I could see, even as a little girl, I could see, their expressions, and it's like we have to prove that we are not malandros, that we're not criminals, that we are law-abiding citizens. But everybody else, the robber could be white, he would not be asked for his ID. And so that has changed to a certain extent, because on the other hand, every day we hear of these cases of, unjustified murders. And now with the internet, now with social media, we are bombarded with the news. And so it's not that it didn't happen before, it's just that now it's very much in the open. And I think it's a concern.
So you wrote a book recently that was just published this year comparing the election of Bolsonaro to Trump, Whiteness and the Nation. So let's just talk about that. There it is. tell us about the book, why you decided to write the book, and what does the book tell us about the reality in Brazil and in the United States?
I've studied race relations. I've been interested in them since I was 14 years old. That's why I went and studied social sciences and anthropology and sociology at university. And but then after I finished confronting affirmative action in Brazil, I was thinking, I want to study whiteness now, because the reason race relations are focused on non-whites, on Blacks, and racial inequality is because whites determine who is white, who is not, who is Black, who is not, who can get in, who must be left out. So I got into that, but I didn't have a focus. It's like, well, what should I focus on? And then I went to vote, and I voted in New York City. Well, I live in New York, and so in New York is where people from New Jersey, from the tri-state area, vote. And so I was standing in line, and I saw those.
This was voting in the Brazilian elections.
Yes, in 2018. And so this is the first round, October. And I'm standing there, and the line is huge. And then all of a sudden, I started hearing 17 in Portuguese. And I looked out, and it was these women, Brazilian women, wearing shirts. That the shirts were Black with sayings in green, I think, but it had a picture of Bolsonaro and written underneath, "Make Brazil Great Again." And I was like, well, I have to write about this. It was like that aha moment, because it was so much. Obviously, it was a copy of Make America Great Again, only instead of red, it was Black and green, and it was shocking to me also because those women in the United States would not be considered white, right? In Brazil, they might, because we know how much more fluid racial classification is in Brazil. But in the United States, they might be called Latinas, right? Because in the United States, they think of Blacks only people from the United States, and then the non-whites from other areas, oh, maybe you're Latino or something else. And I went back to 2016 to the U.S. presidential election, but I also went back to my upbringing, to living in Brazil, and when I was little, I knew of cases of people who was like, I am not Black, I am white. No, I'm going to show you my birth certificate. And the person could be super dark, but see, it says white here, therefore I'm white. And so I thought of the eugenist movement, which was popular not only in the United States, but also in Brazil. And this desire that Brazil has of being white, all the while knowing that it's so Black, that it's, that has the largest population of African descent outside of Africa. So all of that, I was like, I have to write this. And that's how it started. And so what I do in this book is trace parallels between the two histories of the two countries and of the two men. Because my argument, looking at the history of both countries, is to say that neither of them were unconventional, because both of them were, their campaigns were based on like, these two men are different, right? Trump is not a regular politician. Bolsonaro is, we're getting something new here. And my argument is, no, they're both products of this long history of white supremacy, in the sense that, from the beginning, both nations started by establishing certain rights only for certain people who happen to be free men and light skin, i.e. white. And so the thing is, the ones who were not given those rights didn't take that line down. So it's a history of struggles. That's why history is not linear, it's cyclical. And you're a historian, you know that very well. And so at moments, the other part of my argument is after more than 50 years of affirmative action in the United States and more than 10 years after affirmative action in Brazil, in both countries, there was a backlash, a reaction. It's like, no, wait a minute. What's going on here? We long for those other times. And so these men emerged, but, they're not innovative.
So part of your argument is that Trump is a product of the reaction towards the social movements of the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the LGBT movement, Latino activism, immigrant rights, other questions, in which people wish to kind of ignore or suppress or turn back the clock to a period in which white people and a nostalgic, theoretical, idyllic nation existed before these other groups started kind of ruining that American dream. In Brazil, it's a little different, but yet, how do you see the parallel to this situation in Brazil?
Well, I see it in that, affirmative action, which in Brazil, people say, oh, yeah, it's based on the United States. Like, quotas in the United States. Quotas have never worked out in the United States. But the United States has never had quotas. Quotas are unconstitutional in the United States, but they are constitutional in Brazil. But it's the same idea. It's the idea that we have to pay attention to these groups that have been ignored throughout history. We have not gotten, equity. And so in the case of Brazil, the situation is more difficult because one reaction to affirmative action was, but who is Black here? We're all Black in a sense because we are all mixed. So the difference is that Brazil had this myth, this ideology of racial democracy, which comes in handy when underprivileged groups fight for their rights. But when it's not, let's say it's a period of quote unquote stasis, or then there will be racial inequality, but we're not going to talk about it. Then when the groups rise up and react to that, but we're all mixed. My great grandmother was Black. Oh, I have an Indian grandmother who was picked up from the tribe by her hair. Lots of people have the story. Therefore, there should not be affirmative action here, because then everybody should get affirmative action. That's the argument in Brazil. Whereas in the United States, the argument is we're losing ground here, whites, right? Because white historically was so much more defined in the United States, who was white, who was not.
In 2010, I was asked to write a column for one of the mainstream papers in Brazil about the elections. And at the time, I made the argument that one of the issues that was really upsetting Brazilian voters was some significant changes that had occurred, although one could argue that they are not structural changes, but almost reforms that were addressing issues but not tackling the underlying causes of them. But one of them was the ability for people to go to the university, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the program. The other was an economic mobility in which, for the first time, low-income people, mostly of color, were able to afford traveling on the airplanes from their family, visiting their families in other parts of the country, or demanding a better labor conditions, which ultimately were protected by domestic workers getting workers' rights for the first time, and guaranteeing a certain kind of level of conditionality. And so when I made that argument, several of my friends said, well, no, that's really not the case, that you're over-exaggerating an argument. But it seemed to me that the changes that occurred under the Lula administration and were continued by Dilma in these areas were very significant. And whether or not they change the structure of Brazilian society, they seem to certain people create the feeling that that might happen. How do you read this story?
I think you just read my mind, because I was thinking of, that in order for society to change completely, laws can be changed, even structures can be changed, but attitudes also have to change. The government cannot go about, forcing people to think a certain way. And I think that's exactly what happened. I don't think you were exaggerating, but I hear that too. Oh, no, no, there's no problem. This is an importation from the United States, right? To think that it's a matter of color or race, or in terms of inequality, of economic inequality. Yeah, but I help them out. I help my maid. I give her clothes. So I often say that there are some Brazilians who long for the return of slavery, when the hierarchy was so demarcated. So you were talking about people who were able to visit their relatives, to go on a plane for the first time, and how that bothered, because we saw that too, that bothered people. It's like, look at the airport now. Look at these people. Look at the way they dress. Look, they're ugly. And they're too loud. When we know that working class poor people, when they did visit their relatives in other parts of the country, they would go by bus. And, the roads in Brazil are not fantastic. It was an arduous trip, starting with the bus stop. The bus complex in Rio, at least, is, come on. And it's like, what is this? It's like, it's confusing. It's a mess. The surroundings are ugly. And so it's like, that's what they deserve, right? Kind of thing. And for those of us who are better off, then we take a plane. We don't want to mix with them. And it's kind of also like that movie, A Que Horas Ela Chega, right? It's like that movie with Regina Casé, and I forget the other actors, but Regina Casé plays a maid, and from the Northeast. Her daughter is coming from the Northeast to go to take vestibular in São Paulo, and
that's the college entrance exam. Yeah, to prepare for the college entrance exam.
Yeah,
right.
And she goes. She gets to get to university, and the son of the patroa, the people in the house, the son is not, the wealthy boy doesn't get in, and the mother is like, how is that possible? My son went to the best schools, and that's not fair. So it's that idea of fairness also, right? That no, you stay over there, hierarchically, because we know that Brazilians are more comfortable talking about class inequality than racial inequality, right? It's like, no, there's no racism here. But it's harder to find people who will say that there's no poverty in Brazil, that there's no economic inequality. And so when it's blatant that economic inequality is changing, at least from a consumerism point of view, that bothers some people.
Because it implies that people mostly poor, who are mostly people of color, have an opportunity to occupy the same social spaces and have the same opportunities as others. So when Bolsonaro was elected, journalists coined the term the Trump of the tropics. In what ways, in your mind, is Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics?
You and your easy questions. Well, yeah. Also, tropical Trump, right? The Trump of the tropics, tropical Trump. Well, I think Bolsonaro has given indication more than once that Trump is an idol of his, right? So he has, I think, emulated some of Trump's ways of thinking, even words, and even collaborators, right? Because Steve Bannon was part of, was an articulator of Trump's campaign, and he also spoke very positively about Bolsonaro when Bolsonaro was campaigning, that he was a brilliant man, and has a relationship with the family. So this week, one of my classes, they are reading my book, and then one of the students made the comments like, "Wait a minute, so they were both married 3 times, and they both have 5 children." And it's like, oh, wow. That was something that caught their attention. But I think it's that the idea that the status quo is being challenged by people who don't deserve to challenge it. I think that's a point of similarity between the two. So whether it's like in Trump, with Trump, we don't see much evidence of homophobia as we do with Bolsonaro. But with both, we see evidence of misogyny, even though Bolsonaro has never been accused of rape, right? But he has uttered misogynistic statements, attitudes. But we have that with Trump. We have it with Bolsonaro. It wasn't so much the immigrants, right, as it was with the nativism of Trump wasn't as present in Bolsonaro's speech, but the idea that that these people who are demanding these rights, why should we give it to them? It's like indigenous rights and quilombolas, that famous speech. They're worthless. Comparing quilombolas with animals because he used a colonial weight measure to refer to the weight of a quilombola. So, and I think it's fair to assume that Bolsonaro wanted to be kind of like the Trump of the tropics. But another major difference is that Bolsonaro, that Trump is a businessman. Bolsonaro was never a businessman, and Trump does not espouse a defense of torture and a dictatorship in the way that Bolsonaro does.
So in the process of writing your book, comparing Brazil and the United States, what were the challenges? What you're an outsider and insider. You have a real deep inside understanding of your own culture. You have become a very successful academic in the United States, which is not an easy task, coming as an immigrant, operating another language. When you were writing the book, what were the challenges that you faced in drawing these comparisons and thinking about whiteness and race in the United States and Brazil?
Well, I've spent most of my life in the United States. It's shocking to think like, wow, I spent almost twice as long in the United States as I did in Brazil, and I've been teaching these subjects for a very long time, right? Which means that I've been reading about these subjects for decades. And so when I write books, like writing books to me, it is a way of purging all that is inside my head, right? Because it's like, oh my God, I've read this so many times. I've explained this so many times. I'm going to put it in writing because I'm interested in so many things, like kind of like a way of creating more space in my brain. So I had from the beginning, I had an idea. Well, I have to show the history of both countries, following my argument that that whiteness defined both nations, or an attempt to arrive at whiteness. I have to talk about this president and that president to make the point that these current presidents are not novelties. And so I think the biggest challenge for me was writing such a book during the pandemic, because that I hadn't anticipated. And, I had a semester off to finish the book, and then the pandemic ensued. And so to be writing about such heavy topics at a time when we're all isolated, because writing is an isolating activity, as you know, but forced isolation, we had no other choice. And I think it was, and to see the death tolls in both countries. So I was writing about the history in part of both countries, but also the present of both countries. And so I finished the book with writing about the pandemic as an afterword, because I think there were parallels there too. So I think that was the most challenging part.
So let's talk a little bit about your book, Confronting Affirmative Action in Brazil. For some of our listeners and viewers, they might not fully understand the history of the implementation of affirmative action programs in Brazil. So give a little background of how that happened and what have been the results of your finding and your very, very important 2017 book on this.
Here it is, the 2017 book, which I owe to this other book, which I wrote first. So read
the title of your first book.
My first book is called Pioneiros, Cotistas na Universidade Brasileira, right? Pioneers, Quota Students at the Brazilian universities. And I wrote it first in Portuguese because I did the research in Portuguese at the State University of Rio, which was among the first to implement university quotas in Brazil. And my interest in studying that topic, again, was organic. It was the sense that it was actually that I learned that there were affirmative action policies in Brazil, the university quotas, and I started reading about them in 2003, I think, 2004. And it's like, I want to study that. That's when we met, right? And it bothered me that it was so contested, first of all, and the debate was very much polarized in terms of like, this is excellent because it worked in the United States in the form of quotas, and and the other side, no, this has nothing to do with us. This is alien to Brazil, and besides, it did not work in the United States. And I was like, there were constantly, the newspapers would publish op-ed pieces and, all these, and I couldn't see quota students saying how their experiences were at university, how they were received, whether, how they felt about it.
Let's step back for a second so that the listener and viewer understand. So when the State University of Rio de Janeiro organized the program, what were the guidelines in the program? How was it set up? Because it's a little different from the United States. So how did they set it up?
Well, they set up a percentage of the entrance slots, because in Brazil, to get to university, you have to take the college entrance exams and they selected a percentage of those slots to people of African descent, Afro-Brazilians, Afro-descendants, and indigenous people or descendants of indigenous people, and students who had gone to public schools. And the idea was, so there were the racial quotas, which would encompass Blacks, Browns, and indigenous people, and the social quotas, which would encompass students who had gone to public school in middle school or grade school. And the idea was that the public school system in Brazil is such that when that private schools prepare students better to take on the college entrance exam. So usually they, it's easier for them to get in. So the social quotas would take that into account. And so when the debate started, from the beginning, the problem was always with racial quotas, not nearly so much with social quotas. Because as I said before, Brazilians have no qualms admitting that there is tremendous economic inequality in Brazil. But racial inequality, no, we're all mixed, no, we're cordial, no, there's no racism. And so the argument would also say that because Brazilian Blacks are disproportionately poor, the children are more likely to go to public schools. Therefore, social quotas would take care of both, social and racial quotas, which, no, there's two different areas. So I set out to study these. It's like a small sample of students who were graduating. It just so happened that they were, the first class was graduating. And I studied social sciences students and dentistry students. And, social sciences at the State University have always been more racially mixed and economically mixed, but dentistry was one of the elite colleges at the State University. It was much more middle class and up, and also, more white. And so, but what I found was that, what people were saying in the debate, well, the university level of education will go down because these people are not prepared. That has not happened nationwide, not just at the State University, in large part because the professors really had to, to, in some cases, change the way they teach, because, they had a new population. Many of them were first generation, right? These were first generation college students. But professors also noticed the enthusiasm of quota students, that universal students, the ones who got in without any quotas, they said tended to be more blasé about being at university because, it was something that was taken for granted. And whereas the quota students really grabbed it, so that the attrition rates among quota students were lower than among universal students. It's like, no, I have this chance, I have to grab it and run with it.
I always understood that also as an opportunity that people realized that they were the people that were going to save the conditions of their family. In other words, of a poor family whose mother might work as a maid, the father might be a guard or working in some low-paying service industry, having a son or a daughter at the university meant the opportunity of getting a better job, being able to support the family, kind of really raise the entire socioeconomic level of the family from being poor into some place within the middle class. And I think this was one of the things so it would make sense that the students who never imagined they would have this opportunity have it. And whereas if you're from a white upper middle class family who was treated to Disney World when you were 8 and went to a private school. And for our listeners and viewers, the middle class largely in large urban areas sends their kids to private schools. It's part of their expenses, which makes sectors of the middle class also resentful of the social economic situation because they feel that they're spending all this money on their kids, getting them into private schools to get into the free universities. And then if they don't get into the free universities, we've wasted all of our money on them. So, what have been the actual findings nationwide about affirmative action programs? Have they been successful?
Yes, they have. And I just wanted to comment on what you said about, the opportunity to get a degree and enter and experience upward mobility, because that was a counter argument when people said, oh, affirmative action doesn't work. And as a matter of fact, it didn't work in the United States. Yes, it did, because what affirmative action did here was create a Black middle class. The Black middle class existed before, but was so tiny to the point where, when E. Franklin Fraser wrote Black Bourgeoisie, just from 1957, he kind of mocked the Black bourgeoisie. It's like, oh, what we're talking about here are governmental workers for the most part, post office workers, very few doctors and lawyers and dentists. It's like really, clerical workers. And it's tiny anyway. It's like 2%, 3%, something really. And then, as William Julius Wilson shows and argues, is that no, affirmative action created conditions for a Black middle class to grow and be solid, because it required people with higher education. It was, a post-industrial economy requires the population to be well educated. And so it was the ones who could afford to get that education who ascended. And then, of course, that also created the ones who fell further behind because they could not get that, those conditions. So class inequality increased among Blacks. And in Brazil, this is happening too. Like the students that I interviewed in 2006-07, a number of them who went to who got their degrees in social sciences have PhDs now, have doctoral degrees, are working as professors, and the dental students are all working as dentists in their professions. Some have their own business, right? Their own office. So yes, it's worked in nationally. And as I said before, it isn't just the acquisition of a degree, which of course allows people to experience upward mobility on the job market, but also the opening up of their minds. So the experience of going to university is not just, the technical part that you study to get the degree, but, to become the chance to become a well-rounded individual. And I'm mentioning that because a number of my interviewees mentioned that. Like, I had never thought about that, to the point where some people who got to university through social quotas, while at university, started thinking, wait a minute, I used to think I was white, but I'm not really white. So that's another thing that affirmative action has created in Brazil. There are the ones saying, oh, okay, so then I'm Black because my great-grandmother was Black and I'm going to apply for it, and then it's like, no, you live as a white person, but then there are the ones who come from, typical Brazilian families where when one child is white, the other child is, brownish, the other child is Black, and then the child who is white says, no, I'm white. And yeah, but your brothers, I don't care, I'm white. But then going through that experience, like, no, wait a minute, I'm not as white as I thought I was, right? And that was even more marked in the social sciences students because they started studying these issues, right, in anthropology and sociology.
So the program is 10 years old, and the law requires there to be evaluation of the program. I don't know if do you assess there's a possibility that the program will be eliminated, the federal guidelines for affirmative action, that the current government will try to overturn them, or are we here? Is the program here to stay?
Another easy question, but I would say that, well, the program is longer than 10 years, right? It's the law, the federal law that is completing 10 years. Yeah. Right. So what, I think, I often say that that social scientists are not good at predicting the future. I don't think,
Good at predicting the past.
Right. No, but given, I think affirmative action in any country, or any kind of social policy, I would say, tends to be more accepted when when economic conditions are stronger, are better, because then people don't feel that there are things taken away from them to give to somebody else whom they think do not deserve to get that thing in the first place. So that in the United States, affirmative action program, Civil Rights Act of 1964 was well accepted at the time by public opinion, but then the United States was super affluent. As you mentioned before, in the previous government, like Lula and Dilma government, that we saw, people changing from, sheer poverty to not so poor, from not so poor to maybe lower middle class. And so, but the country was doing better, right? Remember in 2011, 2010, 2011, where there was a reverse immigration. People were going to the United States, to Brazil, from Europe, even from the United States, getting jobs there from other parts of South America to work there. And now inflation is high. The prices of consumer goods are astronomical. So I think that's a challenge, but I also think that it's going to remain if people show that, yes, this policy is supposed to be temporary, but it hasn't reached enough people, and there haven't been enough results for us to say, yeah, okay, we leveled the field. We haven't leveled the field. So that's the argument, right? Because that policy is compensatory in a way.
Yeah. So we're facing what many analysts say is the most important election year in the history of Brazil. And at this point, the country is seeming to polarize between two candidates, Bolsonaro and Lula, although other candidates are in the race, but their polling is quite low. I don't want to ask for predictions, but how are you viewing the situation right now?
Well, I'm thinking that it's like how passionate Brazilians are about these elections, presidential elections, candidates, how, I don't remember seeing or hearing here in the United States of relatives who stopped talking to each other because one was going to vote for Trump or the other one was going to vote for Hillary.
No, this happened in 16, maybe not in your family circle. Oh, yes. Yeah. It was, my university even organized a forum before Thanksgiving, right after the elections, of how to deal with the family, because students were so stressed out about fighting with their parents and other relatives about who voted for Trump. So I think that did take place. Maybe because your family social circles are Brazilian, you saw that in Brazil with election of Bolsonaro in 18.
But even before that, with Dilma and Aécio, it didn't start then. And then I know people who to this day don't talk to their siblings. And so I think we're going to see it again, right? I think in part because it sells, right? Because it's media worthy to have constantly to talk about this polarization. And so I don't know, this is a heavy year, right? Because as you said, the most important election also happens in the same year that Brazil is celebrating its independence bicentennial. So, what does this mean for us? Also the 100th anniversary of the modern art week, Semana de Arte Moderna. So are we finally a modern country? Are we finally independent? I think about these things because growing up, we would hear that Brazil was the country of the future. And it got to a point when I said to myself, well, yeah, that's right, because the future never comes, right? The future is tomorrow. Oops, now it's tomorrow, then it's not the future anymore. It's the present. So then it's the future. In the future, things will get better. So I don't know. I'm watching as you're watching.
Nervously, I joke that people who are observers of Brazil should invest in tranquilizer companies, because I think people are going to need them in the second half of the year just to get through the tension around the elections. Vânia, I want to thank you. Exactly. You can recommend one. I'm not a doctor, so I can't prescribe. But Vânia, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Brazil Unfiltered today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. Every time I run into you, it's always a great moment. And I look forward to seeing you soon in New York. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jim. And yeah, thank you for this opportunity. And I'm as you mentioned it, I run into you, and I thought, and we've run into each other in so many places, in Rio, in New York, and on Rhode Island, New Orleans, and so we're running into each other around the globe.
Will you be in Rio this summer?
Oh yeah.
Well, then we'll definitely have to arrange to get together in Rio, because I'll be between Rio and São Paulo all summer. Okay.
Oh, all right. Great. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you so much. Take care.
You too.
I hope you enjoyed the interview. Brazil Unfiltered is part of the Democracy Observatory and supported by the Washington, Brazil office. If you missed our live broadcast of Dialogues for Democracy, in which experts talked about the integrity of the Brazilian elections, you can find the video on the event on this channel. And if you are watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. If you have not yet subscribed, please do so. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please give us a 5-star review to help other people find the program. Until next time, até a próxima.